There we go. We're speaking with Amy Ann Smith. She is a graduate of Memorial University with a Bachelor of Social Work. I am Stephen Ellenbogen, a professor here at Memorial University. So what we're looking at right now is a poster that was created for Exchange 2020, a conference that we presented here. And I'm just going to ask a few questions just concerning the poster and the research that you did, Amy Ann. So thank you for...
Sounds good to me.
Excellent. So in a few sentences, can you explain the research project?
Well, so when I was initially thinking about what I wanted to create a poster on, I thought a lot about the sort of de-evolution of child protection services from provincial bodies to Indigenous groups. And that's not happening Canada-wide, but it has started to happen in different regions, in different sort of sizes and scopes across the country. And in some places it's working as well as can be hoped, and in other places it's not working super well at all. So I wanted to sort of look at two examples of different case studies where de-evolution has started to happen or has been happening for a while, and see what worked and what didn't, and try to think about why. In as few sentences as possible.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And what motivated you to examine this? So what got you interested in this topic?
So I'm from Manitoba, and one of the case studies is the province of Manitoba, and they've been doing de-evolution, or not been doing, but have sort of been working towards de-evolution for years. We started doing this in the 90s. And Manitoba sort of has the unflattering distinction of having the most kids in out-of-home care in the country. There's 11,000 kids in Manitoba, Indigenous kids who are in out-of-home care. 90% of the children in out-of-home care are Indigenous. It's brutal. And this number is just going up. And because de-evolution started in the 90s, the idea that this number increased in spite of the efforts to sort of take child welfare services and sort of move that responsibility to the Indigenous communities in Manitoba, that the number went up just seemed really strange to me. And so I wanted to look at what wasn't working, and think about why on paper something like this sounds productive and sounds positive, but in practice it just wasn't working. And to do that, I wanted to try and find an example of this sort of shift in responsibility in a different region that is working, and sort of try and think about why. So being from Manitoba and sort of seeing the catastrophic effects that child protection services are having on Indigenous communities and on Indigenous kids, it means something to me. I've worked in nonprofit in Manitoba. I've worked with a lot of kids who are in care, and who have sort of been failed by this system, and their parents have, and it's just this sort of intergenerational thing that is awful and challenging, and seeing the effects of that in real life on real people who I really cared about was hard. So yeah, being from Manitoba is a big part of why I sort of picked this project.
That's interesting. Also, that the increase in out of home care, I guess, and the increase in investigations. I know from the course, generally speaking, all countries have witnessed an increase, but I'm not sure it's for the same reasons. Certainly, some of the
Yeah.
content we covered talked about, expanding the investigation to include domestic violence, to include other forms of maltreatment that weren't investigated beforehand, and also kind of this increased awareness. Do you think there's other reasons, or is it pretty much?
I feel like those are it's such a complicated question, that yes, absolutely, expanding it to include domestic violence, and also neglect is a huge piece of that. But honestly, as that increase has happened, a disproportionate number of the kids who are being removed are Indigenous, and so I feel like a part of this issue with like the failings of de-evolution in Manitoba is that these groups are being asked to do a lot more with a lot less. So their funding hasn't increased to sort of reflect the increase in kids in out of home care. And so 3 of the 4 child protection agencies in Manitoba are Indigenous run. And they just don't have they just don't have the money to run them in a way that would be like as probably as culturally sensitive and as just effective, or not even effective is the wrong word. Just there just aren't enough staff. There's not enough of anything. So we're really failing these agencies when it comes to funding primarily.
So that would be, I imagine, one of the main conclusions from your research is that one of the main issues is funding.
Yeah.
Would you be able to talk about some of the other conclusions or findings that you
absolutely
discovered?
Yeah. So in Manitoba, one of the things that didn't really work was it all looked good at first. We got all of the groups together who sort of like should be at the table from different regions in the province, and everybody sort of hammered out an agreement that was agreeable to everybody, and it was sort of celebrated as this productive meeting of different bodies. But at the end of the day, these Indigenous child welfare agencies had to comply with provincial legislation when it came to child protection. And so essentially the power dynamics, like the power structures that existed before de-evolution was implemented, stayed the same. So provincial legislation was recognized as the be-all end all. At the end of the day, the buck stopped there. So there was very little wiggle room for these Indigenous child welfare agencies to sort of work with. So they were essentially, and this is an oversimplification, but essentially trying to provide the same service under the same legislation. Like there was very little room for change, and they weren't afforded that room to change, which really sucks. And so those power dynamics didn't shift. And I think a more effective way, or more productive, a more positive way of implementing de-evolution would be to sort of invert that power structure, which you see a little bit more with the other case study that I considered, which was in Alberta, the Yellowhead Tribal Service Agency. So basically, they deferred to Indigenous elders. So child protection workers would go to Indigenous elders to consult about adoption placements, custom open adoption placements, and about what kind of families they should work with. And so that power dynamic was really inverted, whereas in Manitoba it wasn't. And so I think that's an important piece in my view of like things that need to change. So power dynamics shifting, super important. We can't continue to implement like provincial and federal mandates on Indigenous agencies. It's the same colonial power operating on these bodies, and we're just asking Indigenous groups to do it, and that's just not fair. In terms of funding, yeah, we've touched on this, but there just isn't enough of it. And I know that's a gross oversimplification, but like we're just asking these agencies to deal with some of the most complex child protection cases in Canada, specifically in Manitoba, with just completely inadequate funding. And I know that with our Bill C-92 that's like coming down the pipe federally, that's one of the biggest concerns is funding. The funding needs to be there. We can't just pass legislation without tying enough funding to that legislation. Like it's legislation without teeth, essentially, if we do it that way. So I think that's incredibly important and is a huge part of why de-evolution is failing in Manitoba. And finally, like deferring to Indigenous knowledge. So I think that was one of the most, in my view, most important parts of why the custom adoption worked at the YTSA, is because it wasn't just a program that was implemented by colonial bodies. It was Indigenous groups using the parenting strategies that they've had for generations, and sort of making sure that all of that was embedded into this process. So every significant event in the open custom adoption was like embedded with like Indigenous ceremonies and Indigenous like practices, which was really important. The birth family wasn't sort of erased from the child's life. Instead, the role of like the birth family and of the adoptive family were both celebrated and positive. So not a single one of those placements broke down in the 10 years that that agency was in operation. And so I think that was a huge part of its success. Yeah, so prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and a community approach is like really, really important if you want this to work. Now, granted, the what happened at the YTSA isn't really scalable. You're not going to be able to reproduce the sort of like the communities and the elders in those communities and the relationship that they had with the protection agencies in those communities. So I understand that it's really difficult to scale that sort of up, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's nice to at least hear some positives as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that I guess I've always thought about, certainly doing my PhD and then, getting a faculty job, and so really having a chance to kind of look from a distance is, I think there's, at least for 2 decades, maybe less, there's generally an agreement on most governments' part that devolution of services is really the logical evolution of child welfare services for Indigenous populations. Yet we've seen limited progress on this front. Would you agree that progress has really kind of been less than what you'd expect?
It's been incredibly slow. And I think a lot of, like, I've thought a lot about why that's the case, because you're right. This is sort of the best practice model. It seems like everybody agrees that this is what we should be doing, but we're just not doing it. And so or when we're doing it, there's like fundamental flaws in how we're doing it that makes it really difficult for these Indigenous groups to work and to do and to sort of have autonomy. And so it's really hard to pinpoint one reason that this is the case, because it's just such a complex issue. Canada is incredibly regionalized. The issues that are happening in one province are going to be very different than the ones that are happening in another. But all that to say, I think one of the biggest issues that I'm hoping will eventually be addressed in our sort of like with federal legislation, maybe, is that there isn't a mandate to do this. So there's no sort of like, there's no emphasis on, or there's no body pushing devolution to happen. And so until that happens, I don't think you're going to see it happen Canada-wide, because there's no incentive. We have provinces who have their child protection legislation, and these large systems are very resistant to change. And without a push either from the top or from the bottom, I don't think you're going to see that change. And that's really disappointing, honestly, because we know, like, the research, like, there is research that demonstrates that this is the way that we should be moving. And there's a lot of really, really like powerful, strong, good Indigenous voices who are like also scholars who have been saying this for years, right? But there isn't any incentive to sort of relinquish the control over these communities and over these bodies. And so until there is, maybe it's just like maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I just don't see it happening like writ large.
Not in the short term.
Which sucks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for presenting your poster and giving us some of your thoughts on this important and interesting topic.
Mm-hmm. Just before I go, I think it's really important to say that that doing this research was a bit. I need to be very respectful and very careful, because I'm not an Indigenous person, and my body is not affected by any of this. Like, I haven't been personally affected by a child welfare system that wasn't built for me, or wasn't built with me in mind. And so that's really important. Contextually, I'm coming at this as a white privileged woman. And so, And so I want to do that as respectfully as possible, but also like recognize that there are just things that I probably won't be able to understand. But we'll continue to try and approach that as respectfully as possible.
Yeah, and certainly it's important for us to all kind of increase our own awareness of the issues. So I thank you for that.
Absolutely.
You can't speak from a
Yeah.
person's perspective of the situation and of the realities that are going on in the communities, other than the fact that you are working in Labrador. So I suppose
Yeah.
you have some knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
My pleasure.
we'll see you soon again. Oh,
Cool.
stop sharing. I'm just going to stop the recording. They can do the editing later anyways. So,
Cool beans.